All right, so without further ado, I am going to get started on today's presentation. So welcome everybody. So this is Backyard Bugs, Identifying Insects in the Landscape. And I am very glad to have you here joining me for this talk because it is an important one. We have many a bug here in Florida. And I do want to just preface by saying when I refer to a bug, I am kind of encapsulating all things arthropod on land. So if you talk to an entomologist, maybe in the world of academia, they're going to have a different idea of what the word bug means. But just for the purpose of this presentation, I'm using it to refer to insects, mites, spiders, millipedes, and basically anything that we might just casually call a bug in the landscape. Okay. Now that that's out of the way, my name is Jackie Leibowitz, and I'm the Chemicals and the Environment Agent at IFAS Extension, Sarasota County. So my main areas of focus are the general use of conventional and biorational chemicals, both inside and outside the home. I do a lot of work with integrated pest management, insect identification, and then backyard mosquito outreach and education. So within all of that kind of entomology related programming, I also do 4-H and youth development classes and opportunities. So that, and I also assist with pesticide training programs for those commercial or governmental pesticide applicators. Okay, so this program, Backyard Bugs, is one of many that I offer. So if you like what you hear today and you're interested in learning more about some of the other topics I'll mention, definitely keep an eye on our Eventbrite to see what other possible class topics we're offering throughout the year. Okay. All right, now moving on to the meat of today's presentation. Here's our little outline for today. We're going to be covering a quick overview of insects, so some of their common characteristics and life cycles. We'll talk about their feeding strategies in the landscape. We will discuss some of the representatives of the most common species that you might find in the landscape here in Florida. And then we'll go over a just quick a little bit about beneficial insects and bugs and their place in the ecosystem as well. And then at the end, provided we're on track and we have time to talk about it, I'll briefly touch on integrated pest management and biorational pesticides and how they could apply to you and your landscape management, and then questions. Okay, so insects rule the world, and when I say that, I really mean it. Worldwide, there's approximately 1 million described species of insects. So that means insects that we've actually been able to name. So there are likely far more out there that are still looking for names that could be discovered by any of you, perhaps. But yeah, we have 1 million described across the world. And of that, there's 91,000 described species in the United States, and again, more to be discovered here as well. In Florida, we have over 12,500 insect species alone. So I love that. And some of you might be a little horrified to learn that there's so many different kinds of insects, but hopefully by the end of today's presentation, you'll develop an appreciation for all those bugs out there. They're also very old. They've been around for a long time. So fossil records actually indicate that insects came on land more than 325 million years ago. And you'll hear different perspectives on this. I've heard 200 million, 1.4 billion, 2 billion. So the jury's still out on the exact proportion, but what we do know is that there are a lot of insects per human being. So if you think about the proportion there, really, insects rule the world. They are everywhere and they far outnumber us. Now, of all those species that have been described and discovered, we estimate that about 99% of them are beneficial or harmless. So they're not causing us any issue in our landscapes and our lives, and they are certainly still serving some kind of function in the ecosystem at large, right? So they're either food for wildlife, or they may just be doing something that we don't quite understand or grasp yet. So then that leaves just about 1% of insect species as true pests. So those are things that can harm us in the long run in some form or fashion, or they could just be an annoyance, right? So we're going to get into some of those pest species in the landscape. But before we do that, I want to touch more on the basics of insects. So there are a few characteristics that make them very successful. So they can produce a large number of offspring very quickly, and many species have multiple generations in a season. And we're going to be talking about aphids later in the presentation, which I would say takes the grand prize when it comes to reproduction. And this quick reproduction as well, although we're not going to really get into the details of it, is kind of the primary reason behind pesticide resistance being as much of a problem as it is. They're also very good at camouflage, many species, so they can blend well into their environment and go undetected. They also have a protective shell, which we call an exoskeleton, and that helps keep moisture inside their body. And here's a big one. They're very small and they can fly. So their small size and ability to fly helps them to quickly escape from enemies as well as disperse to new environments. Right. And like we mentioned, Florida has over 12,500 native invertebrates, and then 1,500 endemic invertebrates, meaning that they just occur here. All right, so just going to touch on some general characteristics of insects. Like I said, we're going to talk about other bugs today, but insects are definitely a primary focus. So insects have 3 distinct body parts or regions. So that's going to be their head, thorax, and abdomen, and they occur in that order. They have that exoskeleton that I mentioned that kind of provides that external structure, and all of their guts and important things are inside that exoskeleton. They have a segmented body, paired jointed legs. Most have wings, and when they do have wings, they're either in 1 or 2 pairs. They have a digestive, circulatory, and nervous system, kind of like ours, but not exactly. And then they breathe by gills, trachea, or spiracles, depending on where they live and what stage of their life cycle they're in. So like I mentioned, we're going to be touching on some non-insect arthropods today too, but I just wanted to make sure that you understood the important distinction, because that really does come into play when you're figuring out how to manage pests. All right, so let's talk a little bit about insect growth and development. So when you're looking at how an insect grows and develops from an egg to an adult, there's 2 main types of development for insects, and that's complete and incomplete metamorphosis. And metamorphosis is describing how that insect grows, so how it goes through distinct stages from egg to adult. So incomplete metamorphosis, there are 3 stages of development. So it goes from egg to nymph to adult. So the immature insects need to grow, and they grow quickly, and they'll molt between 2 to 7 times before they become an adult. And these stages as immatures are called instars. So sometimes you'll see them referred to first instar, second instar, and they might look a little different depending on which instar they're in. In incomplete metamorphosis, the nymph does usually look like a miniature version of the adults, but an important distinction to make is that only the adults are going to have fully formed wings. So nymphs will have wing buds, so you'll see where those wings are going to develop, but they won't have wings. So a few insects that go through incomplete metamorphosis are cockroaches, crickets, chinch bugs, mole crickets, and grasshoppers. And insects with incomplete metamorphosis, so both the adult and the nymphs, are going to eat the same thing. So knowing how and what an insect eats is important when it comes to determining how to manage that particular insect. And we'll talk more about that later, but just wanted to mention it here. Now, complete metamorphosis, we have 4, not 3, but 4 stages of development. So that's egg, larva, pupa, and adults. The larval stage looks very different from the adult stage, and the immature stage is not going to have wings until after it pupates. So complete metamorphosis, those immatures look nothing like the adults. And another thing to note, right? So not only do they not look alike, but they don't eat the same thing. So the adult and the larval form are going to eat different things most of the time. So a great example of this is caterpillars and butterflies, right? So a caterpillar might munch on leaves while a butterfly is going to sip on nectar from a flower. All right, so some examples of insects with complete metamorphosis are butterflies, moths, lady beetles, other beetles, and lacewings. Right, so with all insects, only the immature stages are going to molt or shed their exoskeleton, and that's because they need to grow. So once they're adults, they don't need to grow bigger, and their energy can therefore go into reproduction. And that's also a primary reason why the immature stages are generally more destructive to plants. They are needing that energy, kind of like our children, right? They're bottomless pits. They need to eat a lot before they can grow up. And as you get older, right, your appetite generally lessens. All right. So although 99% of the insects in our landscape are beneficial in some way, sometimes it seems like we only have pests in the landscape. So we can put these pest insects into 2 different categories. So there's ones that have piercing, sucking mouth parts, which are stylets that act as a syringe or a straw. And we'll get more into those examples later, but just some examples are mites, aphids, scales, mealybugs, thrips. And then the second group are insects with chewing mouth parts. So some examples of those are caterpillars, grasshoppers, beetles, mole crickets. So the first group of these 2 categories are the piercing, sucking insects, and they're the ones that we need to be the most concerned about because they have the ability to vector virus and disease. And insects that have chewing mouth parts, for the most part, usually only cause aesthetic damage. So plants usually recover from that chewing damage, but certain diseases can be a death sentence to plants. Okay, so we don't always see these insects or these bugs with piercing, sucking mouth parts, but we can see the damage they cause, especially when it's above a certain threshold. So these insects are usually less than ½ an inch in length, and a lot of them are between a 1/16 and an 1/8 of an inch, so very tiny. They have specialized mouth parts called a stylet, and it basically acts like a hollow needle, right? They're sucking up liquid using those stylets. And sometimes they're huge, right? They can be 1/2 to 2/3 of the insect's body length. So what they do using these mouth parts is pierce the plant tissue with their stylet, and then they suck the plant juices out, the phloem or the sap specifically. And like I mentioned, these insects are going to be more problematic because they can transmit diseases to the plant and between plants in your landscape. So a lot of the damage can look similar. It can be very hard to diagnose the species unless you see it feeding on the plant. So whiteflies, spider mites, which are not insects, we'll get into that later, thrips and lacebugs, their damage is going to look very close to each other's. And then mealybugs and some scales can look very similar as well. And mealybugs, which you can see right at the top there, have kind of a cottony look to where they're feeding on the plants, and certain species can cause cabbage head, which you can see is kind of scrunched up on hibiscus. And then the coconut mealybug on palm looks very similar to cycad scale. Sooty mold is not damage, but it's an indirect or secondary effect from the insect feeding. So this isn't going to directly hurt the plant, but it can sometimes reduce the plant's ability to photosynthesize and make food for itself. So with cases of large outbreaks where there's a lot of sooty mold, that can be a problem, but otherwise it's really the feeding that's the thing to worry about. Okay, so like I said, they are small, right? So the first piercing sucking insects we're going to cover are scales, but then we'll get into mealybugs, aphids, whiteflies, two-spotted spider mites, chinch bugs, and thrips. And these are just a small representation of all the different pests that may be in the landscape. So this is not a definitive list by any means. All right, so we're going to talk about the armored scales first because they don't cause those secondary symptoms of sooty mold, which can be found associated with other insects that have piercing sucking mouth parts. So armored scales pierce individual plant cells and they do not produce honeydew, which creates that sooty mold. It's basically like the perfect growing medium for that fungus. So their waxy outer coating is separate from their body and it can be removed. And once that armored scale starts to feed, its legs will retract and the insect will remain stationary. So it's not going to move from that spot. They're very good at camouflage. I've actually been given plants before where I thought, okay, what's wrong with them? And I had to take a much closer look to see the scale along the stems. So they really are great at camouflage. So it's important to know what you're looking for, and I recommend having a hand lens out there when you are looking around and monitoring plants in your landscape. So from left to right, we have the Florida red scale and the T scale. So the crawlers are the easiest to target with sprays when you do need to use sprays. And the crawlers are that immature stage of development. Now, control for armored scale is going to be different than controls used for soft scale. So what's recommended is horticultural oil on the adults. Insecticidal soaps are not as effective. Now, the crawlers, you can use those insecticidal soaps, but in the adult stage, you're going to want to rely on the horticultural oil. Okay, here is the Asian cycad scale. So these are males, females, and eggs all in this picture on the left. So you can really see where they coat the cycad all along the fronds. All right, so we just talked about armored scale, right? And that they're not associated with sooty mold. So I just want to get more into sooty mold for a second. So here it is up on the screen. You can see it pretty clearly. It's going to grow on that honeydew that I mentioned. Those are basically sugary excretions or sugar poop that comes from the insects. So they feed on that sugary substance, that phloem from the plant, and whatever they don't use basically gets excreted as honeydew. So once you manage the insect, right, then the sooty mold is going to slowly dissipate. You can also get rid of it with a blast of water. And like I mentioned, sooty mold isn't really a death sentence to the plant, but sometimes it can affect the growth because it covers the leaf surface and that can affect photosynthesis. Okay. So that honeydew can be excreted by soft scales, mealybugs, aphids, and whiteflies. It's made up of carbohydrates, so it's very sticky and shiny, and you might even notice it on your plant leaves before that sooty mold starts to grow. And the honeydew actually attracts other insects that will feed on it. So if you've ever seen a bunch of ants maybe crawling on your plants, they could in fact be farming honeydew off of one of those sap-feeding insects. Okay. So soft scales. So clockwise from the top right, we have soft brown scale, tulip tree scale, and then Florida wax scale. And soft scales excrete a waxy coating that becomes part of the insect. So if you tried to flip the scale over, the entire insect would become dislodged. Once the adult starts to feed, it's and going to stay there throughout its lifespan. So they're stationary. Their immature stage is also called a crawler stage, just like the armored scales. So they're crawlers, and that's because it's crawling around until it finds somewhere to feed. So controlling soft scale, you actually do want to use insecticidal soaps. They're going to work better on the adult stages of this scale. So the best way to remember this, the 3 S's: soft scale, sooty molds, and then insecticidal soap. So it's important to know which insect you have and what stages are present on the plant. That's going to make it easier to target correctly. All right. So cottony cushion scale, you can find mostly on woody ornamentals and citrus. The females are hermaphrodites, so they actually produce both sperm and eggs. And you can see the sooty mold, right? It's kind of that black sooty appearance, sometimes kind of a dark gray or charcoal, so you know it's soft scale. Mealybugs are a type of scale, but all stages are mobile. So they also excrete honeydew. So you'll usually see sooty mold associated with a mealybug infestation. But like I mentioned earlier too, there's that kind of cottony appearance on plants where there is an active infestation. Here is the pink hibiscus mealybug, which I have a personal vendetta against because it always takes down my cranberry hibiscus at home. But you'll notice that it has a cabbage top, so it's kind of like wrinkled on the end of the hibiscus plant. And this isn't going to recover, and it's not going to produce a beautiful hibiscus flower. So the best thing to do in this case is to trim it off or trim the bush completely so that you're able to remove all the mealybugs, both the adults and the crawlers. And eventually the bush will recover and be healthier without those mealybugs present. And then just making sure going forward before things get out of control, monitoring it for mealybugs and other pest insects, that will allow you to stop the infestation before it gets too extreme. And then, yeah, so if you have a large bush, that can be trimmed of those infested branches, you can then spray it with insecticidal soap. So if there is sooty mold, then insecticidal soap will be effective. So it really depends on the stage that your plant is at and how bad the infestation is on for what would be best for managing it. Okay, so aphids have a pear-shaped body, all different colors, and they can change colors depending on the season as well. So they start showing up in the spring. We have all that new tender growth, and that's what they love to feed on. And they are pretty incredible. So in the spring and summer, those females are going to reproduce asexually. So they'll just give birth to live young that are all female. And a female aphid can live 25 days, and it can give birth up to 100 live young. So a lot. Like I said, they kind of deserve a trophy or prize for the reproduction. And an aphid can go from birth, right? So when it's born, to reproducing in less than a week. So a very short time span for that as well. So because of that though, right, they are multiplying very quickly. So infestations can go from just a small amount of aphids to a large amount of aphids very quickly. So even though they are a pest, we kind of consider them the chocolate of the insect world. So they're full of those delicious carbohydrates from feeding on the plants, and just about everything eats them. So you can use a jet of water or soap spray to control if you need to, or you could rely on those natural enemies present in the landscape to help keep populations down. And those are just some examples of aphids you might find here in Florida. So there's the green peach aphid, oleander aphid, and bean aphid. And here's just an example of aphids on roses. So this level of infestation could just happen in a few short days. All right, talking about whiteflies next. So from the clockwise from the top right, we have whitefly larvae, pupa, and adults. All right. Now, the silverleaf whitefly is also called the sweet potato whitefly, and it can be a vector to many diseases that affect vegetables, especially tomatoes. If you keep tomatoes, you may very well be familiar with this species of whitefly. So the adult's going to lay eggs on the underside of the leaf, so it's really good to be proactive. Look when you're kind of monitoring plants in the landscape at the underside of the leaf to see if there's any feeding going on, or to see if there's any eggs that can be controlled. And the first 4 instar stages are the feeding stages, but then that pupal stage is the red eye stage. So you can see those little red eyes on that pupa. And so it's not going to feed at that time. So it'll become an adult, and it's really important to try to focus on those feeding stages there. Now, if you can't, if it's just a bunch of pupa, you can use a contact insecticide. You just don't want to use something that's going to require them to eat it or ingest it, because it won't work at that point. And make sure too, for any kind of treatments, that you're doing them after you've exhausted other options. Okay. Here is the rugose spiraling whitefly. So it feeds on palms, woody ornamentals, fruits, and many other plants. It's an invasive species, and by 2025, they had already found it on 115 different species of plants. We also have the ficus whitefly, which you can most often find on weeping fig. You can also find it on the false banyan tree, Cuban laurel, strangler fig, fiddle leaf fig, and the banana leaf fig. And ficus hedges are highly susceptible, as you can see the damage in that picture on the bottom. Okay, so here are some of the piercing sucking insects that we've talked about so far. So we've talked about scales, mealybugs, aphids, and whiteflies. So let's move on to the rest. Next up, we have 2 spotted spider mites, and these are not insects. These are arachnids. So they're related to spiders, ticks, and of course other mites. So you're not going to be able to use traditional insecticides, right? Because it is a mite. So you'll have to look at miticides if you're using those conventional chemicals. But again, really as a last resort, there's a lot of other options to use before we rely on those conventional chemicals. Now there's little spider webs, right? They're called spider mites for a reason. They produce kind of a fine web on the plants where they're feeding, but it makes it very difficult to penetrate that web with any sprays. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Now I mentioned, right, there's other methods besides sprays to rely on for management of the spider mites. So there's a predatory mite right there, and they are fabulous biological control agents of these 2 spotted spider mites. This is a Persimilis species, and it only feeds on the 2 spotted spider mite, and it is very hungry, so it'll eat a lot of them. But keep that in mind, that if the 2 spotted spider mites are gone, so too is the predatory mite. So it will die out with the rest of the spider mite population. You'll often find that mite damage is more severe during dry weather when it's dry and hot. And that is what the uh, damage looks like on plants. So you'll see kind of a stippling pattern where it looks like little tiny dots where the spider mites have been feeding. And you'll also see a little bit of yellowing as well, oftentimes. Okay. Now here's that webbing, right? I talked about how sprays are difficult to use when a plant is covered in that webbing. So if you see this on your plant, on a large portion of it, I'd say my recommendation would be to trim that plant extensively or just pull it all together. You don't really want to rely on sprays, and then beneficials are going to have trouble getting through that web as well. So yeah, it depends on the stage of your infestation. Okay, so thrips are interesting because they are piercing sucking, but then they also are the only insect with a rasping mouth part. So I like to kind of call them rasping sucking mouth parts. So they'll scrape the top of the leaf where they're feeding, and then they'll taste it to see if they want to feed on it. Now, some people actually have a sensitive reaction to thrips, so they can get rashes from them on their skin. Something worth noting if you're going to be handling a plant that has a thrip infestation. And because they are rasping in addition to piercing and sucking, they cause damage to the top of the leaf, and it usually looks kind of like a bronzing scar. So the leaf will have a bronze look to it. And that is what the damage from thrips looks like. And not only do they feed on leaves, but they can feed on flowers as well. Okay, so chinch bugs, everyone's favorite. We get a lot of inquiries about chinch bugs at our office. It is Florida's most destructive turfgrass pest. Because it mainly attacks St. Augustine grass, and the majority of Florida homes have St. Augustine turfgrass. Now, it's not only going to be found on that type of turfgrass, so always keep your guard up for these pests. And you're going to see chinch bug damage most prominently in hot, water-stressed, and sunny areas of the lawn, mainly again in St. Augustine lawn. So if there is a lot of thatch buildup as well, or your lawn is stressed, they're going to be more susceptible to an infestation. All right, so now we're just going to quickly review some insects with chewing mouth parts. So again, they're not going to really be vectors of disease like the piercing sucking insects and bugs are, but they can cause some pretty major aesthetic damage. So caterpillars, leaf miners, grasshoppers, mole crickets are going to be the ones we talk about today, but there are many more. Right. So we'll start with the oleander caterpillar. So you might imagine that it feeds on oleander. That's definitely one of the plants it can be found on, but interestingly too, you can also find it on desert rose. So when the caterpillars are young, they'll skeletonize the leaves as they're feeding and chewing on them. And then as they grow bigger, they'll actually eat all of the leaf tissue except for the midvein. So it goes from kind of more of a skeletonized look to larger chunks taken out of the leaves. They sequester the toxins from the oleander plant as well, so that makes them not very desirable as a snack to other animals. And the adult is known as the polka-dotted wasp moth or spotted wasp moth, and there it is on the screen. Here's the snowbush spanworm, which is not a worm, but in fact a caterpillar. And the adult is the white-tipped black moth, which you can see in the bottom right-hand corner. And they are found mostly feeding on snowbush. That's their primary host plant. So if you don't want it around, maybe pick a different plant or just be aware that it's going to be defoliated for part of the year. I have heard from many that they just spring back like nothing happened the following season. Now let's talk about the serpentine leaf miner, one of many different leaf miner insects. So the adult lays an egg between the plant leaf tissue, then the egg hatches, and while it's feeding, it's mining through the leaf, creating that distinct pattern on the left. And then the larvae, or maggot eats an exit hole and then drops to the soil where it pupates and then emerges as an adult fly, just to begin the cycle all over again. So it's really a major issue in landscape plants, but sometimes in vegetables it can cause some problems. All right, grasshoppers. We have our Lubber grasshopper here up on the screen. Some of you may be very familiar. Nymphs will hatch out in February and March, and then the adults emerge usually around April and May. They only have one generation a year. They love lilies, orchids, a very wide variety of plants. So here in Sarasota County, we mainly see adult lubbers with this yellow or orange coloration, but there are adults in other parts of the state that have the black body with orange, red, or yellow accent colors on the wings and body. The adults have small wings and they don't really fly, and they have very skinny legs compared to their body, so they can't jump very well either. So you're mainly going to see them walking around. The immature stage or nymph can be confused as a different species because the coloration is very different, right? You can see the contrast up there on the slide. But the black nymph, right, does not have wings. So that's your tip off there. That's how you know it's an immature stage of the grasshopper. Mole crickets, another fan favorite. So these can be pretty devastating to lawns here in Florida. And we do have all three species shown up on screen here in the state, and the males will come out of their burrows at night, call to attract the females. I think they're kind of cool to look at, but a lot of people might not feel the same way. They're just very interesting. You can't really mistake them for much else. Now they stay deep in the soil when it's dry, but then rain and moisture and irrigation will bring them closer to the surface. So if you do have to treat for mole crickets, make sure that you irrigate first, and that'll drive them closer to the surface for treatment. And you can see their tunnels, but you can also tell if your grass is kind of spongy when you walk on it. And that's because they're feeding on the roots of the grass. Now, there are some biological controls for mole crickets that have been established in Florida. So there's the Lara wasp, that's a parasitoid of the mole cricket, and then there's also parasitic nematodes. All right, we're going to briefly touch on beneficial bugs, because again, very few insect species are pests in the landscape. I did highlight some, but there are many more beneficial bugs. All right, so some of you may have seen these in your landscape before, and you may have had a first instinct of wanting to kill or destroy them. They look kind of scary, I think, to the average person, but these are nature's best pest control. So these are beneficial bugs that we call natural enemies. We have the lady beetle larva, mealybug destroyer, lacewing larva, the big-eyed bug, assassin bug, and predatory stink bug. So when you think of beneficial bugs, you can generalize them by putting them into buckets. So there's pollinators, right? So these include insects that pollinate crops that we need for our food, and then also flowers in our backyards and natural systems. Now we have detritivores or decomposers, which act as nature's cleanup crew. So they help break down organic matter in the ground and recycle those nutrients back into the earth. And then predators, right? So these are going to be bugs that eat other bugs, and they're very important biological control agents. And then parasitoids, kind of on that same vein, are also beneficial insects that help control pest species. So you'll usually see, at least when we talk about biocontrols and natural enemies, they're going to fall into either the predator category or parasitoid category. So those are the main buckets we're focusing on because they help keep those pests in check. So lady beetle larvae can eat a lot. So can the adults. So the large adult lady beetle can eat 60 aphids a day, and then smaller larvae might eat 25. But in her lifetime, a female lady beetle might eat 5,000 aphids. Imagine that, 5,000. That is a lot just for one single beetle. And they don't just eat aphids, they eat a lot of other small, soft-bodied insects that we consider pests as well. They are available for release in the yard. You can definitely do that. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that a lot of those commercial lady beetles are going to come from California. So when they wake up in the morning, they are going to fly down into the valley from the mountains to feed. So if you get your lady beetles and you want to run out and release them, we recommend kind of keeping them on hand, maybe putting them in the fridge for a very short period of time and then releasing them at night. So when the sun comes up, they're going to realize their food source is right there, and then they're not going to fly away. So lacewings and lady beetles are really the two best beneficial insects that are abundant in the landscape that folks are familiar with. They're both going through that complete metamorphosis that we talked about. And I just wanted to show you what the immature and adult stages look like so that you can recognize them and let them do their job in the landscape. There's the praying mantis. So this is kind of a sit and wait predator, and it's going to eat whatever it can capture. So it might be a good bug as well as a bad bug. It just depends on what's available, right? All right, and then there's the parasitoid and predatory wasps. So parasitoid wasps inject an egg in or on the insect, and then it hatches from inside the insect body, or it'll enter the insect body, and then it's going to consume the insect from the inside. So a little gnarly, but again, very helpful for the management of pests in the landscape. And then predatory wasps are going to sting the wasp, paralyze it, and then drag it back to their nest where eggs are laid near the paralyzed insect. So they're not going to enter the insect's body, but they are going to consume it. And then majority of adult wasps aren't going to feed on the insect at all. So they're usually pollinators, and they're feeding on nectar and pollen. So those immature stages are what feed directly on other insects. So here is an example of parasitoid wasps creating aphid mummies. So they eat the inside of the aphid and then emerge out through little round exit holes. If you see these on a plant, you don't need to control them. The wasps have already taken care of it for you. And then here you can see a parasitized scale, and you can actually see the wasp growing inside of it. Spiders are our last beneficial we'll talk about, and there are many spiders in Florida. Sometimes they give people the ick, but they're very important. So they can be, they are predators of many pest species. They can either spin webs, so like our orb weavers that we have up on the screen, you can see to the right. They may hunt, so wolf spiders do this, where they go out and they hunt for prey, or they might be ambush predators, where they sit and lie in wait, and then when an insect gets close enough and is unsuspecting, they strike. So it's important to give beneficials a chance, let them do their job, right? So before you go straight into managing those pests, see if it can naturally be taken care of, and then if not, that's when you might want to work on an IPM program. So that's our last topic of today is IPM. What is IPM? That's that integrated pest management. So it's basically taking into account how we do pest management in a long-term sustainable way, and then making sure too to focus on prevention more so than treatment, because that's always the easiest, cheapest, and most sustainable thing to do. And then using a variety of methods when we do need to treat for a pest, to make sure that we're not using conventional broad spectrum sprays as a first resort. And it's all about reducing risks to ourselves, animals, and the environment. 5 main steps. So identify is really important. And we do offer free insect identification services for Sarasota County residents. So if you're interested, definitely take a look at our online form. You can submit pictures through there or just drop off a sample at our office. We're located at Twin Lakes Park. So once you've identified to see whether it's a pest, then you're going to monitor it in your landscape, see, okay, how is it acting? How are my plants? And then you determine when to take action. We call that the action threshold. So if it's at a level where you feel your plant is at risk of dying, or maybe you don't like the aesthetics of it, then you would go ahead and move into applying those IPM methods. And then after a while, taking a look, evaluating the program. If it's not working, making adjustments. Here's what the IPM pyramid looks like. So I won't spend too much time on it, but you're basically focusing mostly on prevention at the bottom of the pyramid, and then you're working your way up to the top. And then at the very tippy top, we have our conventional pesticides, which can still be a valuable tool, but we want to use them sparingly so that we're not putting our environment or ourselves at risk of harm. Some helpful tools to have for IPM include a hand lens. You can either get one for your bag or on a keychain, and then of course field guides to help you identify while you're out there. I like things that are smaller that you can put in your pocket, and this is all relatively affordable to get and have on hand. I'll send out some links in a follow-up email that basically show you some of those field guides in the UF IFAS bookstore that you might want to have on hand. So when you do need to use chemical controls, always start with the least toxic options. So those are some of the things listed on the screen. I know I talked a little bit about the horticulture oils and sprays. There's also diatomaceous earth, spinosad, sulfur, BT is great for control of caterpillars, mosquitoes, fungus gnats, neem oil. I'm going to make sure everybody has this presentation in their inbox, so that'll go in that follow-up email as well, so that you can always reference it if you're looking for some of those least toxic options for control. And then we also have a biorational pesticide talk coming up in August, I believe on August 20th. So if you're interested and want to learn more, register for that. But I just want to end today's presentation with, when we kill off the natural enemies of a pest, we inherit their work. And that is a great and impactful quote from Dr. Carl Huffaker. And it really does resonate, right? So if we are just non-selectively trying to treat for all the bugs in our landscape, just killing indiscriminately, then we're going to have to do that work of some of those natural enemies. All right, well, thank you all. I'm going to go ahead and have a little lunch, but I really appreciate everyone being here and for your attention.